Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Richard Green, and I'll be moderating the session. As president of Barrett & Green, I'm a senior fellow for the Council of State Governments, in addition to work I do as a columnist for Governing Magazine, a senior advisor for the Pew Charitable Trust's Government Performance Division, a special projects consultant for the Volcker Alliance, and so on. I want to welcome you all to the CSG eCademy webcast titled Creating Trust in Government through Civics Education. One of the hottest topics in state capitals, from coast to coast, is the subject of trust in government. Survey after survey seems to indicate that the public's faith in their governments has been steadily dropping. In fairness, it's been dropping far more at the federal level than it has at the state or local level, but the numbers don't look very good for any of the three levels. One important solution to this issue is to make steps to make sure that Americans have the best possible understanding about how their governments work. It's hard to trust a government you don't understand. Unfortunately, civics education has taken a back seat in public schools and universities alike. And it's an open question as to how people can possibly be expected to trust an entity that they simply don't understand. Typically, the civics education that's being given focuses on the most basic of the most basic elements of the federal government. We'll be focusing a bit today on what's happening at the state level, above and beyond what's happening at the federal level. Today's session will be recorded and will be posted in a few days to the CSG Knowledge Center website. We've got a lot to get to in the next hour, and I think you'll find the commentary of our three panelists to be both intriguing and useful. In a few minutes, I'll kick things off and introduce our panelists. After that, we'll have our presenters respond to your comments and your questions. This is really a very important part of the webinar, and I'd like to encourage you to participate. If you have a question for any of our presenters or just a question you'd like any of our presenters to address, you can type it into the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Those will be collated in CSG headquarters in Lexington, and I'll ask as many as we have time for at the end of this webcast. But first, I'd like to introduce our speakers. And this is the order in which they will be speaking. First, we have Ted McConnell. He's the Executive Director for the Campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools. We then have Andrew Seligson, I should say, Andrew Seligson, who's President of Campus Compact. And finally, we have Dick Simpson, a Professor of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And now, without further ado, as they say, I'd like to turn the session over to Ted McConnell. Ted?
Thank you very much, Rich, and thank you, CSG, for the opportunity of speaking with you today. I know that CSG has had an interest in the issue of civic education. I'd like to give a shout out to my friend, your immediate past chairman, Senator Mark Norris of Tennessee, who has done so much to revitalize the civic mission of schools in Tennessee. Thank you, CSG, for your concern over this issue. Carrie, next slide, please. On behalf of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and Congressman Lee Hamilton, co-chair of the Campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools, we'd like to talk with you a little bit about the state of civic learning, civic education, and why it is so vitally important to the future of our representative democracy. The quote on the screen right now from Justice O'Connor says it all. Next slide, Carrie. Civic learning is vitally important, as I mentioned, to the future of our country. You know, self-government requires far more than voting in elections every 4 years. It requires citizens who are informed and thoughtful, who participate in their communities, are involved in the political process, and possess moral and civic virtues. Generation of leaders, from America's founders to those who established our system of public education to elected leaders in this century, understand that these qualities are not automatically transmitted to the next generation. They must be passed down through education, through our schools. Ultimately, schools are the guardian of our democracy. And here we see some of the many, many reasons civic learning is so valuable. Next slide, Carrie, please. For the past 4 to 5 decades, civic education in this country has been in decline for many, many reasons. Starting with, you can really date it to Sputnik, when the Soviets sent up that small basketball into space, and our leaders began panicking in the 50s that our schools weren't keeping up in math and science. Sound familiar? That long, steady road has led us to this. Since 1998, on the most recent, or on the most reliable measure we have nationally on how well our students in this area, barely a quarter of K-12 students could demonstrate a frankly dumbed-down proficiency in civics. There are large gaps between student attainment, between various population groups. If you're a student in a wealthy suburban school, you're going to get a pretty good amount of civic learning. Not so if you're in an inner city school, a rural school, a school facing testing pressure for not doing well in other subjects. This threatens to disenfranchise people and to deprive our fellow students of the civic knowledge and the skills needed to participate. Next slide, please. 3 courses used to be the norm in American high school. Now they're down to just 1, all too often in 12th grade. State standards have become an overloaded laundry list of names, dates, and places to memorize, and as Rich superbly mentioned, there's far too much concentration on the process of government rather than the importance of civic participation. Next slide, please. There has been a significant decrease in the elementary grades in the time afforded for this subject. Matter of fact, the Center for Education Progress has quantified this decrease at 35% since 2000 of the amount of time afforded to this subject in the elementary grades. An overemphasis on a few subjects over all other subjects has added to this long, slow decline in civic learning. Next slide, please. Now, civics is still taught in schools. I don't want to leave you with the misimpression. The problem is the quantity of time that's afforded and the quality of civic instruction. Over 70 national organizations representing education groups, policymaker groups, civic engagement groups have joined together in our campaign to try and improve civic learning K-12 in every school in the country. Next slide, please. Here we see on this slide some of the many, many benefits of civic learning. A couple I want to highlight for you are students who receive effective civic learning K-12 are more prepared to engage in discourse that is civil, that is productive. Also, civic learning helps develop the very same skills that students need for success in college and in the workplace. Next slide, please. We recommend to every school in the country that there are 6 essential proven practices that must be part of civic learning. The practices are up on the slide. Unfortunately, the most common of these practices in most schools today is just classroom instruction, and as Rich mentioned, it concentrates too much on structure rather than the why of participation. But all 6 of these elements are essential towards an effective, well-rounded civic learning experience. More information on this can be found at our website. I'll give you that address in just a minute. Next slide, Carrie. The public supports revitalizing civic learning. They support the civic mission of our schools. In a PDK Gallup poll that was released last month, look here, 26% of Americans believe that preparation for citizenship is the most important job of public education. 81% of Americans in this PDK study supported the notion that civic learning was one of the top 3 purposes of public education. Next slide, please. We believe we're turning a corner, and you in the states are absolutely essential to what happens next to improve the civic learning in our nation's schools. Of course, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESEA Act of 2015, devolves power and decision-making to the states. We are particularly excited about 2 aspects of ESSA. One, the student support and academic achievement grants in Title IV, sometimes called the Well-Rounded Education Program. This competitive grant program allows states to empower school districts to concentrate on subjects that have previously been neglected. States right now, state departments of education, are making their plans to submit to the Federal Department of Education on how they will expend this money. We urge all states to make sure high-quality civic learning is part of their student support and academic achievement grants. For the first time since 2012, there will be federal-level support funding for innovation in civics and American history. That's part of the new ESSA law. And it reaffirms once again that civics, history, geography, economics, the social studies are one of the 4 core essential subjects for education. Very important. Next slide, please. That's a quick overview on where we are on civic learning. My good colleague Andrew will talk about civic learning in the higher education setting, but for more information on the current state of civic learning, on ideas to improve your states to civic learning, please contact us. Thank you very, very much.
And thank you so much, Ted. That was terrific and interesting, and raises a lot of interesting questions that I'm sure our audience will want us to ask you later on. But now I'd like to turn the session over to Andrew Seligson. Andrew, will you take it away?
Thank you very much, Rich. Thank you, Ted. Ted has done tremendous work and is a great ally of Campus Compact and our higher education partners. And I'm really pleased to be on with Dick Simpson as well, who's done terrific work at UIC and through the APSA. Thank you also to CSG for organizing this, and to all of you who are listening to this conversation. I always think of webinars as being the place where faith and science come together. I think there's some kind of scientific account of how this whole thing works, but I just take it on faith that there's someone out there listening as we're speaking from our offices. So I really appreciate your taking out some time for the conversation. What I want to do is 4 things. One is say a little bit about the context of civic education, civic learning in higher education, the context of higher education against which that takes place. The second is to say some things about the state of state policy in this area. The third is to say a few things about what individual institutions of higher education are actually doing. And then finally to talk a bit about the role of higher education associations, including Campus Compact, but again, along with many partner organizations in advancing the kinds of goals that Ted was just talking about and that I think we all share. Next slide, please. So when we think about the background of higher education, there's a number of things that are relevant to this question. The first is the extraordinary diversity among institutions in the United States. Obviously, we have public systems. Within those, there are often layers of systems. Some states have systems plus institutions that are sort of free of those systems. We have 2-year, 4-year institutions, those with graduate programs. We have public, we have private, we have faith-based. So there is no single, even sort of a set of like entities that constitute higher education. In addition, institutions are relatively autonomous compared, for example, to public schools. And that's true, obviously, especially of independent institutions, but it's also true very often of public institutions to a great extent. The third reality, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, is declining public investment in higher education. That's true generally in the sector and especially of our public institutions, and it's true kind of no matter how you look at it. So we know that that has a number of impacts, but one of them is that it's very difficult to have conversations about adding where there's a lack or filling in a gap because that's felt very strongly in the sector. Again, there are a very small number of institutions that are almost accepted from that because they sit on large endowments, but for the vast majority of the, say, 3,000 higher education institutions in the country, that's the background reality. On the plus side, we have the deep history of liberal arts education in the United States. And for those of you who are a little weak on your Latin, liberal arts comes from the Latin artes liberales, the skills necessary for a free person, and that means a citizen. So the idea that education at the higher education level ought to be education for citizenship is baked into our history and our traditions of our higher education institutions and is still a resource to draw on. At the same time, it is contrasted at the moment with a lot of pressure coming from a number of directions for institutions of higher education to focus on job training especially. And again, we have a ton of evidence that the best workers on the job are those with a broad set of intellectual skills and the capacity to work with others effectively, critical thinking skills, all of which are deeply connected to preparation for citizenship. But it also turns out that that's not always the easiest case to make. Next slide, please. So to say just a little bit about state policy, I was actually at a conference, an international conference on the public purposes of higher education not long ago, and some colleagues from South Africa were making a presentation about universities in their province and their work in the area of civic education, civic partnerships, and their first slide showed the policy context that was driving their work, and it was a slide packed with information. National policy relevant to these endeavors, provincial policy relevant to these endeavors, and it occurred to me that for most of us, if you put up the same slide for institutions of higher education in the United States, it would be blank. So for most institutions of higher education, whatever they're doing in the civic learning realm is not driven by state policy one way or the other. There are some exceptions. A key one is Massachusetts. So Massachusetts in the last few years has become the only state to identify a set of civic learning outcomes that are expected for graduates of all public colleges in the state of Massachusetts. I just want to tell you a little bit about that effort for a few different reasons. So they define civic learning as acquisition of the knowledge, the intellectual skills, and the applied competencies that's for informed and effective participation in civic and democratic life. It also means acquiring an understanding of the social values that underlie democratic structures and practices. So Massachusetts adopted that, and they have set to work on putting that concept into action in their public institutions. Next slide, please. And as you can see, the action plan to make that set of learning outcomes real has a number of steps. And I want to say one thing for those who are not so familiar with this language of learning outcomes. In higher education, this has become an important part of the way we think about curricular development, pedagogical development, and it essentially involves reverse engineering. What are the outcomes we want our students to leave the institution with in terms of learning, and then how do we get there in terms of what curricular and pedagogical and co-curricular opportunities must be in place in order to produce those outcomes in students. So Massachusetts identified 4 steps. The first is building civic learning into campus strategic plans, driving resource and program development. The second is facilitation and support for campus work and civic learning through conferences, meetings, etc. The third, along with, by the way, funding for projects on campuses to build out the capacity in this area. The third is development of new ways to measure and report student civic learning outcomes, and that's a very lively field in higher education. We, for example, just undertook a joint meeting with ETS as they are seeking to develop better measures in this area. And the fourth is collaboration with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to develop a cross-sector plan for civic learning from kindergarten through college. And again, the efforts of, that Ted was just describing in the context of K-12 schools are integrally connected to our work because students come from one to the other and because the two kinds of entities have great opportunities for partnership. Unfortunately, Massachusetts this year reduced funding to support this effort. So there is less support for campuses, and to a great extent they're kind of on their own again in trying to figure out how to do this. So it's great policy. Obviously it needs support to be effective in the long run. Next slide, please. So, next slide. Maybe it's going. There we go. Okay. I might have had a lag on my end in seeing it. You know, again, most of what happens in institutions of higher education is decided at the local level by institutional governance or other kinds of entities. And so at Campus Compact, we are a national coalition of 1,100 colleges and universities committed to the public purposes of higher education. We have members that are public and private, 2-year and 4-year, in states across the country and a few internationally. We view our role as both driving the preparation of students for lives of democratic citizenship and also facilitating partnerships between campuses and communities to advance public democratic goals. Democratic, obviously, with a small d. So that's who we are. We survey our 1,100 members. As any of you know who do surveys, you don't always get 1,100. So we had 400 respondents this last year. And I just wanted to show you a couple things from the survey to talk about what institutions are doing today. So one question was, for the institution, do you track participation in courses that, and you can see the questions, that focus on diversity, that build skills in deliberative discussion, that involve simulations, that contribute to democratic participation, etc. So about half our institutions do track participation in some of those things and about half don't. That's not to say that they don't do any of those things, but I think, you know, one of the things we've learned is that if institutions aren't tracking it, they are not prioritizing it and ensuring that all of their students do it. So that's to some extent an indicator of how they're valuing in an affirmative way, in a way that's built into institutional practice, civic learning. Next slide. So the next question I want to share, does your institution identify specific student engagement outcomes for community engagement? And that is to say, one of the practices, and Ted referred to service learning, we see experiential learning as crucial in this domain, and so we want to know whether institutions are thinking about the learning that comes out of that. Again, a little bit more than half do, and then you'll see the reason that's significant in the next slide. And so this asks, okay, if you're tracking them, what are you looking at? And it turns out that, again, the largest answer is civic or democratic learning. So we have a lot of institutions that are thinking about using experiential learning, community engagement to drive civic and democratic learning, and that's really important. But again, that's a number that's true of about half, 80% of half of the institutions in Campus Compact. So it's still just a slice, and that's a set of practices we're trying to drive forward. Next slide, please. I just wanted to say a few things about associations and the work that we are doing in this sector. In 2012, the Association of American Colleges and Universities published a report in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Education called A Crucible Moment, and it really called for a renewed focus on civic learning, and I think sadly, prophetically described what could happen to our democracy if we do not ensure attention to these matters. It called for making student civic learning pervasive and expected, and it has had very positive results both in driving changes on campuses, but also, I would say, in continuing to build collaboration among higher education associations, those concerned with the curriculum, those concerned with the co-curriculum, and creating a stronger network for advancing this work. So I think we're building a movement that is more and more effective at advancing these goals in a challenging environment. Next slide, please. We at Campus Compact are an active contributor to that effort, and so I just wanted to mention a few things we're doing as examples of this kind of work. One is we've put together and we're able to run in the last year an urban and regional civic learning partnerships initiative. We did that in partnership with the Coalition for Urban and Metropolitan Universities, Generation Citizen, and the Education Commission of the States, looking at building regional K-12 higher ed partnerships to advance civic learning and student success. And we got some really interesting experiments going. We had 10 cities and regions around the country participating. We're constantly looking for funding to run the project with more regions, but we found a tremendous level of interest at both the K-12 and higher ed level, and a lot of interest in participating by a wide range of community entities or public entities like police forces and libraries and other youth-serving organizations. So that was cheering. We have, if you go to compact.org/action statement, compact.org/action statement, you can see a document recommitting to the principles of civic engagement, civic learning, now signed by 450 of our member presidents, that commits them to build campus plans to advance this work. And so we're spending this year supporting campuses in the development of those plans. And a major focus of that is integrating student engagement into broader institutional partnerships for the public good, so that students learn by participating in real efforts at change, linking their institutions with K-12 schools, and again with a wide range of public entities. So that's a snapshot view of the sector, the state policy role, the role of individual institutions, and how higher education associations are seeking to move this work forward. And I'll be very glad later on to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very familiar, even prior to helping to put together this webinar, with the really good work that Campus Compact has done. In prior conversations I've had with Andrew, I've pointed out to him that my daughter was working with a Campus Compact effort at the University of South Carolina for 2 years, and it was really the highlight of her collegiate and post-collegiate education. I'd like to now turn it over for sort of our grand finale, which will be followed by a question and answer section. I'd like to turn the webinar over to Dick Simpson. Remember, everybody, be thinking of questions you'd like to ask. If you've got the questions but you don't give them to us, they're not going to get answered. And now, Dick, if you could take the microphone, please.
Certainly. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. So all of this started because there was a perceived problem of youth participation. In most elections, particularly non-presidential elections, the turnout has been low. Students have often voted at only 20%. In presidential elections, it might go up to 40-some-odd%. We also know that students no longer read newspapers. They have other social media to get what they do in information. And we know that neither the schools, the elementary and high schools, nor the colleges are educating for democracy on a significant scale. So we're in a good moment in the sense that there is now a national push. And the national push is to teach civic engagement, not just civic learning in the sense of static things like how many branches of government there are, and that's joined by national groups like Campus Compact, American Political Science Association, which has produced books like the Teaching Civic Engagement books that are free, also our journals and our Teaching and Learning Conference. We're joined by the Higher Learning Commission, which for all the Midwest, which stretches almost coast to coast, certifies whether or not universities can continue to be accredited. The AAC&U, which Andrew already mentioned, and a bunch of other national groups related to colleges and universities. But there is a problem. Based on our historical studies, in the past when there has been a push to educate for democracy, say with John Dewey and the progressives of the turn of the 20th century, that process has caused change, but it has only lasted a decade at a time. So we probably have less than 10 years in which to make a fundamental permanent change. And legislation is a large part of what is possible. Let me go through some of it. So the national government requires all universities to celebrate Constitution Day. Constitution Day is important as a kickoff to our civic engagement projects in universities that know how to use it, that have controversial speakers talking about the issues in the Constitution, again, not just the three branches of government. We are also mandated to do voter registration, but we can do that by just sending one email, which the students ignore. So what we have to do is to several things by legislation. The one I'm going to talk about particularly is require that civics as civic engagement be taught in high schools, which we have just managed to do in Illinois. We need more funding, which has been hinted at particularly in the first talk. If we're going to require civic education and engagement at the college level, we need funding. But beyond that, we need an action plan. We need to know where each university is now and what are its goals in improving its situation. But I want to talk particularly for state legislators about the Illinois experience. So Illinois had not required anything except a state constitution test for decades. We did not require civics to be taught in high school. As long as we're teaching reading and writing and arithmetic, that seemed to be good enough. And what we've managed to do is now require civic engagement be taught in at least one course in every high school in the state of Illinois beginning next year. We did that by first forming a legislative task force. Probably at the state level, you aren't going to just introduce a bill and have it magically passed because everybody agrees that education for democracy is a good thing. The real question is, what is it you want to specifically do? How can you get a bill that would actually move forward with both requirements and funding? And we were lucky in Illinois because we already had what were called democracy schools. We had model schools that had been identified by the McCormick Foundation, and the effort in the legislative task force was headed by Sean Healy of the McCormick Foundation. And they made sure that these really worked and that there was real leadership going into them beyond the state legislators who were on the commission and the other officials. They held hearings throughout the state and showed easily enough that there wasn't much being done in civics and that students didn't have a decent civic engagement education. And then they were able to push for legislative action, introduce a bill, pass it, and get the governor's signature. Now, whether this is the ideal piece of legislation, it may differ. Other states may already require teaching, but you have to follow up also by changing the social sciences curriculum, which is done by a separate agency beyond the state legislature. So it seems to me that, first, this is an important area. It is something we know how to do. The book for the Political Science Association is called Teaching Civic Engagement. It is mainly for political scientists, and we're now doing teaching civic engagement across the disciplines. The Campus Compact Pledge and the documents they've produced at AAC&U, this is not a mystery. It's not that we don't know what should be done. We can outline what should be done. There has been neither the requirement that we do it nor the money to allow us to do it. In Illinois, we used to be, our cost of an undergraduate's education used to be funded 48% by the state. Back 2 years ago, it dropped to 14%, and we've had an unstable budget in only about 50 or 60 or 70% of that amount. We are losing money in education, and we can't both lose money and do what we need to do. We don't need a lot more money for the civic engagement purpose. It has to do with the campus adopting a policy that they're going to do civic engagement and that they seriously monitor what they have done, and as Campus Compact says, plan for the future. So you can legislate either regarding the high schools or the elementary schools or the colleges. Probably you should do it for both, and you're probably going to start by forming a task force if you don't have one in the state already. And we'll be glad to take your questions and answer from examples across the country.
Terrific. Well, thank you, all three of you. We do have some questions here, and I suspect that that more will be coming in as well. And the first question is for Dr. Seligson, and the question is, does the Massachusetts policy you described have any mechanism for holding IHEs accountable for civic learning outcomes, or is it simply a supportive policy with no teeth?
So this is where I will acknowledge not being an absolute expert on Massachusetts higher education in particular. My understanding of the policy from what I've read, and I could certainly share some documents which could be then shared out by CSG if that would be helpful, is that that there are not specific accountability measures built in. It's now one of the expected outcomes. It's relevant to decision making, including reaccreditation, et cetera, for those institutions. And is kind of part of a larger state process, but there's not a separate set of accountability measures tied to that. But I think, again, one way to think about it is this is adding to an existing set of learning outcomes, civic learning outcomes, and so it's being built into the same sort of review of institutions as everything else colleges and universities are supposed to teach students. So it doesn't have kind of independent mechanisms associated with it. It's part of the ordinary state process now.
I would like to comment on the Illinois situation. In Illinois, it is absolutely a requirement. After 2018, no student can graduate high school without taking the required civics course, and the ideal model for social science and history to teach the course involves civic engagement activities. I won't list all of them, but you can find out. But there is a requirement. No one graduates high school in Illinois anymore with no civic engagement. Now, whether it's enough, that's a different issue, but when you start with zero, getting something is a pretty good step.
Absolutely right, Dick. This is Ted McConnell. I want to pick up on comments that Andrew and Dick have made along the line of how to do it, how to improve civic learning opportunities K-12 and higher education. The requirement that Andrew described came about from the Massachusetts Select Committee, Special Select Committee on Civic Learning, which was created by the state legislature, chaired by former State Senator Dick Moore, who had an especial interest in making sure that higher education was included. Dick has mentioned our Illinois campaign headed by Sean Healy at the McCormick Foundation, where that truly has been more a private sector-led effort in Illinois. And can you believe in 2016 there are still 9 states that don't require you to take a course in civics to graduate from high school? I won't name them right now, but I'd share them privately. In California, we have exciting things going on in civic learning in a task force that is co-chaired by the state chief justice and the state-elected superintendent of public instruction. In Tennessee, we also have good things going on, and that's an effort that's led by the legislature, most importantly, your CSG former state national chairman, State Senator Mark Norris of Tennessee. There are a variety of ways to approach policymaking in this, and those are just a few examples of how policymakers can take the bull by the horns and make meaningful difference.
That's terrific. Very, very interesting. There's another question has actually just come in, but before we get to that, I do have a question, which is there any connection? We've talked about K through 12. We've talked about higher ed. Is there any connection between the two? Between the two, is there any effort to build on what's being done in the in the K through 12 system to build on what's being done at higher ed?
Not much
Yes.
so far. There's some early steps, and I'll let Ted talk about the specifics of what's desired. But at most universities, if you get out of high school and get through our admission process, we don't look to see if you have any civic education background, and we don't give you credit in political science courses. Most of our effort is to try and coordinate with community colleges, the four-year and graduate institutions, try and work with community colleges, and so we have to depend on community colleges being part of the total network providing the civic engagement because they have a huge number of students. But there have been some attempts for universities to provide help in designing syllabi for the civic engagement efforts at high school, but we don't acknowledge it in terms of giving credit in any way when you get to the university.
And this is still me asking. And does anybody think that it's too bad that there isn't more of interweaving between the two?
Well, this is Andrew. One of the things I'd say is a couple different things that I think are happening in this area. One is we've got some really great models of programs that connect colleges and universities with K-12 schools to advance civic learning for students at both levels. One example is a program called Public Achievement that was built at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, now associated with Augsburg College, and it has a model like that. And another is Generation Citizen, which has been a partner of ours, and they both involve different versions of college and university students serving as sort of democracy coaches for K-12 students who are engaging in experiential projects that build civic and democratic skills and learning. And you know, I know Generation Citizen has programs going in a number of cities across the country. And again, when we talked about this effort we had to build urban and regional partnerships for civic learning, it was connecting K-12 and higher ed. The Education Commission of the States also developed a policy framework for civic learning, and that framework really is a P20 framework. So it looks at creating models for both integrating education, primary, secondary, with higher education, and creating structures to kind of drive students through learning along those levels, as well as really try to promote integration of the community into the education process to create opportunities for hands-on student civic learning. So I think there's been a lot of good thinking, a lot of good experimentation and models, and again, I think bringing some of these things to scale through policymaking and through the kinds of material support that are necessary is really the challenge.
So let me just stress, one of the problems has been we have not had partners in state government. Everything has been done either by foundation grants, by universities' own money, by national projects or national organizations, so that if state legislators were to seriously take up this cause in states across the country, we would have enormous innovation and much more success.
I second what Dick just said, especially to all of you state legislators out there. Civic learning is supported by the public. This is something that is vitally important to the future, and we do need more public money in civic learning. Dick is absolutely correct. There has not been as much intentionality between K-12 and higher education in working on making sure that it's a seamless experience for students K through higher education. There are islands of excellence in there. Most of our state-level campaigns do involve higher education. Dick, thank you so much for all that you did in Illinois on the success there. I just want to pick up one last thing on something that Andrew said, and that is the role of the nonprofit civic learning programming community in this country. That's where the innovation has come from. Programs like Justice O'Connor's iCivics program, which truly engage students. Teachers report the biggest problem they have when they use iCivics in their classroom is getting students to stop playing the games. It's experiential learning at its finest. The programs of the Constitutional Rights Foundation, both in Los Angeles and Chicago, that offer national programs as well. The Center for Civic Education. We have a rich variety of programming for after-school and out-of-school student participation as well. But for those things to truly reach all students they need to reach, we need policy supports and we need financial support. Thank you.
We've got a question here for Andrew Seligson. Again about your great Massachusetts example, and the question is, does the Massachusetts policy that you described have mechanisms for holding IHEs accountable for civic learning outcomes?
So actually, I just did a little Googling to inform myself on the state of play, and I think the idea is that, you know, as I mentioned, part of the action plan was to develop metrics for measuring student civic learning in public institutions in Massachusetts, and the idea is that as that is achieved, those will then be built into the existing accountability framework for student learning in Massachusetts. So there is an accountability program already with public institutions. It doesn't now have built into it metrics for civic learning. As those metrics are developed and as programs are implemented, that will be the case. So there will be accountability built in. And I do think, you know, again, one of the challenges we have at the college level is really building out metrics that people can agree on and that are useful both for, you know, especially for a continuous improvement of programs. And so there's a lot of work being done in that area by researchers, again, within and outside higher education. But I think being able to measure it better will certainly help us build strong systems. But, you know, I don't think that right now is the major limiting factor, as we've been talking about.
There are a couple of other levels at the state that often get overlooked. Every state has the equivalent of the Illinois Board of Higher Education, which does all of the planning for all of the universities. And they also have some sort of state superintendent of schools, and that varies a lot in states how they've constructed that. So it is possible for state legislators to use those other levelers if there's an interest. Also, if you called my university president before your committee at budget time and said you would get money if you do A and B and you won't get as much money if you don't, guess what my university president would do in such a circumstance?
Well, I think we can all guess. There's been questions come in actually from a couple of people. You've all made reference to civic engagement, not necessarily in opposition to, but as distinct from civic education. Can any or all of you sort of talk about concrete examples of what civic engagement means?
Well, first of all, civic engagement is informed by civic learning. You have to have skills that you learn in schooling, civic skills. You have to have basic civic knowledge. You don't write your congressman if you're upset about your trash collection. And you have to have a disposition to participate. Now, what forms can the civic education or civic engagement take? Well, voting's just the tip of the iceberg. It's the easiest form of civic engagement. Caring about what happens in your community, getting involved in your community, working with others to make a difference in your community. Caring about what happens and expressing yourself on the public square on matters of public importance. Dick and Andrew, I'm sure you can add to that list.
Well, if we think about teaching civic engagement, there are only 4 or 5 methods that have been shown in practice to work, and then there are different ways to use them. One is the teaching civic knowledge, which Ted just spoke to, but there is also speakers, debate, discussion in the classroom kind of situation where they learn to debate respectfully and to hear speakers from different points of view, and it stirs them up to think about important public questions. There are simulations. There is service learning, which is to go out into the community and work with community organizations. And then there is the more direct involvement like internships where you actually work for a political campaign or work for a community organization and find out what it's like to do it in practice by actually doing it. So there are a few others, but that's basically the method. And we can instill this knowledge, both experiential and factual. And in fact, what we usually find is if we give them the experiential knowledge, they will fill in any missing knowledge they're having. You can imagine, we can teach how a bill becomes a law in our state legislature. But if we can get them interested in any law, it becomes much easier to get them to care how a bill becomes a law.
I can give, just to add to those excellent descriptions, so one example, I'll just think of a few things from my own work. When I used to be Associate Chancellor for Civic Engagement at Rutgers-Camden, and we developed a model we called Engaged Civic Learning, which were academic courses through which students would be engaged in public work, public action of some kind, in order to advance the learning goals within the course as well as larger civic learning goals. And that became a designator that was built into the general education curriculum. In other words, every student to graduate now, on that list of things they had to do, and along with learning how to write and learning how to do some math and et cetera, had to participate in courses with an engaged civic learning dimension. And we had courses that might be in the biology department where students were learning about environmental issues and also engaging in action to understand how you make change in policy. It might be courses in more sort of obvious places like political science where you're participating directly in public processes that you're learning about, in courses on state and local government, etc. Courses in literature where you might be engaged in public efforts to advance literacy in the community and understanding how policy for those things is shaped. So a wide range of disciplines, but sharing this idea of connecting the knowledge in the classroom with knowledge gained through experience to build both disciplinary and civic learning in concert.
A question has just come in that actually relates back to something I seem to have said at the outset. The audience member says that I had at the outset talked about how much of civic education is focused on the federal government, much less so about the states. And the question is, first of all, do you, any or all of you, agree with that? And if so, why is that the case, and why would it be important to do more about the states?
It's vitally important to ensure that students have an understanding of how state and local government functions. And in fact, this area has suffered, like the rest of civic education, in a decline. It used to be fairly common, generally at the middle school level, for there to be either a large amount of a course or a full semester course devoted to state and local government. Those courses today are very rare. I know Texas still has one. I believe California does. It is vitally important that these 6 proven practices that we've alluded to include study of state and local government.
And does anyone else want to take that one as well, or should I move on to the next question?
Well, I'll just say at the college level, we've limited study of state government and even local government to 1 or 2 courses in the entire curriculum. We may train 500 or 600 students a year in American government and particular subtopics. We probably train only 30 in state government and probably only 80 in local government, or something in those sort of proportions.
And
I would just say,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, go right ahead. The only thing I was going to say is just in my work with college students, you see it, that they really think that when they think about policy questions, they only think about the federal government. Obviously, it's an overgeneralization, but it's a pattern, and they are genuinely surprised to learn how much impact state and local government has on issues that they really care about personally.
Right. Andrew, I see that your Massachusetts example seemed to have captivated the audience. There's another question pertinent to Massachusetts. Do you know offhand if there's any background as to what got that effort rolling and what other states could learn from Massachusetts in terms of accomplishing similar kinds of efforts?
The thing I know about it, and again, Ted may know more and more specific than I do, that my understanding from some folks who were directly involved in the process is that this had to do with a larger planning process in the state, rethinking higher education, called the Massachusetts Vision Plan, I think is the name of it, but there may be some other part of it. And the focus was really on preparing the workforce for the 21st century that the state of Massachusetts needed, and that was kind of how the thing was charged and how it got rolling. And I think it was a little bit of a rearguard action of people saying, you know, these are the public institutions in the state, and it is a historic part of our mission and our charter, et cetera, to prepare students not only to be contributors to the economy, but also to citizenship. And I think they were able to build consensus for that view. And so the process was expanded, and from that effort came this decision to generate a specific set of learning outcomes in the area of civic learning, and then an effort was undertaken actually to build those out, to identify the outcomes. That's taken place, and again, the part that's not yet done is identifying the metrics. But I think I do think, as we've talked, sort of alluded to, there's a lot of evidence that the notion that there is some inherent contradiction between preparing students to be contributors to the economy and preparing them for lives of citizenship, the notion that there's some inherent tension between those, I think, is crazy. It turns out that the things that make you an effective contributor to the economy, like the ability to think innovatively, work with others, solve problems, these are all things that allow you to be an effective citizen. It turns out that you need some more things in both cases, so it's not that there's a complete overlap, but we can do both together, and I think Massachusetts recognized that, and again, that's what led them to take a step that no other states have in this domain, and I absolutely think it's replicable, and again, there's evidence out there about the overlap of the skill sets. The AAC&U does great surveys of employers to say what are the skills you're looking for in graduates, and if you look at them, civics education and civic experience, civic engagement advances those learning outcomes that employers are looking for. So I think we can start to break down the assumed tension between those things and think about how to build curricula that advance both goals together.
And I think the Illinois example is a good alternative, which is either taking a standing legislative committee or, in the case of Illinois, forming a task force with members from the House and the Senate, made sure that we ended up with actually passing the laws.
And it was a happy convergence there in Massachusetts that at the time the visions work was being done, the legislature created the Special Select Committee, and Senator Moore ensured that the work informed each other. 16 states so far have formed officially sanctioned state commissions or task forces on civic learning. Tennessee has had one that did great work. If your state hasn't, may we commend that idea to you of bringing together practitioners, policymakers, and parents for a thorough discussion of the state of civic learning in your state and make recommendation to policymakers on how to improve. Our nation's future is at stake.
And again, it's not quantum physics. We actually know what needs to be done based on experience.
Yes.
And that kind of leaves us with time for one more quick answer to a quick question. And I think this is for you, Ted. You had mentioned early on building trust in government. Can you help us to connect the dots between improved civic education and trust in government?
Effective civic learning done systemically, K through higher education, acquaint students with the philosophy behind our system of government, its history, its warts and all, and serves as an antidote to the misinformation and the pessimism that arises from where most students get their information today. It can rebuild trust in our public institutions.
Well, that was just exactly what I was looking for, and I think that's about all the time we have for this afternoon's eCademy webcast. I want to thank our guests again, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today. This webinar will be archived in the CSG Knowledge Center, so if you missed any part of it, or if you'd like to share this with any of your colleagues who would be interested, you can listen again. We encourage you to send a link to colleagues and others who are interested. I certainly will. And be sure to keep an eye on csg.org to find out about future events in the eCademy series, not only on transportation as today's civics, but on all of the very many policy areas that the CSG covers. Have a good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us today.